The second phone slid out of her purse and hit the kitchen tile like a gunshot, and when the screen lit up, I saw a name I had never seen before sitting on top of a thread full of hearts. My hand started shaking so hard I almost dropped it, because the preview line underneath that name said, "Same time tomorrow, your husband won't suspect a thing." I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just stared at that glowing screen and felt my whole marriage tilt sideways. But let me start from the beginning. I'm a pretty ordinary guy, the kind who believed stability was its own kind of romance, the kind who thought being dependable was how you prove love over time, and for years that belief seemed to work for us. My wife, Melissa, and I had routines that felt like a safe house. Coffee together in the morning, dumb jokes over dinner, the same couch spot at night while she scrolled and I pretended not to fall asleep halfway through whatever show she picked. We were happy in that quiet way couples get when they've stopped performing for the world and started living for each other. Then she got a new coworker, and at first it was harmless, even sweet, because she'd come home with stories like, "You would love him, he's funny like you," and "He's the only one who understands how crazy the new system is." She said his name a lot, casually at first, like weather talk, like it meant nothing. "Dylan said this. Dylan thinks that. Dylan helped me fix that report." And I remember smiling and saying, "Tell Dylan thank you for saving my wife from spreadsheet misery." And she laughed like nothing in our world could ever break. But the worst part was yet to come, and I didn't know it was already walking toward me wearing her favorite smile. The first red flag wasn't one big moment. It was a slow change in her rhythm, like a song shifting keys so gently you don't notice until it sounds wrong. She started staying late, just to catch up. Then, because the team needs me. Then, because the boss is watching. And every explanation came with this tired little sigh that made me feel guilty for even asking. Her phone became an extension of her hand, always face down, always close, and when it buzzed, she'd angle her body away like she was shielding it from the room. She bought a new perfume, not a cheap impulse one either, something sharper and brighter than what she'd worn for years, and when I said, "That's new," she answered too quickly, "Oh, I got it at work. They were handing out samples," which would have made sense if the bottle hadn't been full size and still in the box. One night I reached for her phone because mine was dead and I wanted to check the weather, and she snatched it back so fast her knuckles went white, then forced a laugh and said, "Sorry, it's just a mess in there. I need to clean it out." I tried to keep it light, so I said, "I've seen your camera roll. I survived the great casserole phase." And she didn't laugh. She just kissed my cheek and went to shower like she couldn't get away from the conversation fast enough. What I discovered next made my blood run cold, but at the time I kept telling myself it was stress, it was work, it was adulthood chewing us up like it does to everyone. Still, a quiet alarm started ringing in my chest, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it kept ringing. I didn't confront her because I didn't want to turn suspicion into a weapon and swing it blindly, and I didn't want to be that husband who accuses without proof and then has to apologize forever. I decided that if something was happening, the truth would show itself if I stayed calm and watched carefully, and if nothing was happening, I'd spare us both the damage of a baseless fight. So I did something that felt both patient and terrifying. I documented patterns. I noted the nights she was late, the times her phone lit up, the way she suddenly cared about looking office polished, even on days she used to wear sneakers. Then I took one extra step, but I did it the right way, because I wasn't about to ruin my own life by doing something reckless or illegal. I called a lawyer for a consult, described the situation in broad terms, and asked what I could do in my own home without crossing lines. She told me very plainly that recording in common areas of my own home could be legal where I live, but that bathrooms and bedrooms were off limits, and that I should check local rules and keep everything clean and above board. So I bought a basic home security camera, the kind people use for packages and pets, and I placed it in the living room aimed at the front door and couch area, clearly visible if you were paying attention, but not screaming for attention either. I told Melissa we'd had a few car break-ins on our street and said, "I just want to be safe." And she nodded too fast and said, "Sure, whatever you think." Like safety was suddenly none of her business. But the worst part was yet to come, because once the camera was there, my house stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a stage where I was the only one who didn't know the script. The first few days gave me nothing dramatic, just small things that somehow felt worse because they proved she could lie easily. Monday, she came home late, walked in with her hair slightly damp like she'd rushed, and said, "Traffic was terrible," even though the app on the counter showed a clear commute. Tuesday, she came home with a plastic bag and told me she grabbed dinner at the office, but when she hugged me, I smelled that new perfume and something else underneath it, a men's cologne, clean and expensive, like a department store. Wednesday, she said she had to work Saturday because there was a big deadline, and when I said, "We can reschedule dinner with my brother," she answered, "Please, I just can't deal with extra stuff right now." And her tone was so sharp I backed off like I'd touched a hot pan. Each night, after she fell asleep, I checked the camera clips like I was watching my own life from the outside, and each time I felt ridiculous, then relieved, then guilty, then sick all over again. On Thursday, I got my first real peace. She came home earlier than usual, and instead of going straight to the kitchen like she always did, she stood in the living room, pulled her phone out, and whispered, "I'm home," in a voice I didn't recognize. Then she smiled at the screen. Not a polite smile, not a social smile, but the soft one she used to give me when we were still new. My stomach tightened, and I heard myself say out loud to an empty room, "No, no, no," like words could undo what I'd just seen. And then I saw something that changed everything, because the next clip showed her picking up her purse, reaching into a hidden pocket, and pulling out a second phone I didn't know existed. The day I found it in her purse wasn't heroic or cinematic. It was just a normal Saturday morning where she was going in for a few hours, and I offered to make her coffee while she showered. Her purse was on the chair, half open, and when I moved it to wipe crumbs off the seat, it tipped, and that phone slid out like it had been waiting for air. It wasn't her usual phone, not the one I'd seen her scrolling on every night, and it wasn't old either. It looked new, clean, charged. I didn't unlock it because it was already unlocked, sitting there lit up as if someone had just been typing, and there on the screen was a thread with Dylan's name at the top and messages stacked like bricks. I scrolled just enough to see the shape of the truth. Plans, pet names, complaints about me framed like jokes, and one message that made my throat close. "I love when you lie to him. It's like our little secret." I heard the shower stop, and my whole body went cold. But I forced myself to put the phone back exactly as it was, because I needed more than rage. I needed a clean ending. When she came out, towel on her hair, she said, "You're quiet. Everything okay?" And I managed, "Yeah, just thinking about errands." She kissed my forehead and said, "You're the best." And for a second I almost laughed at how cruel that sounded. What I discovered next made my blood run cold, because if she could say that while carrying a second life in her purse, then she could do anything. That week I moved like a shadow in my own house, and I played my part so well I scared myself. At dinner I asked, "How's work?" And she answered, "Busy, but good." And I said, "I'm proud of you." And she smiled like she deserved it. When her phone buzzed, I didn't glance at it. When she said, "Dylan's team is a mess," I didn't flinch. But I kept gathering, quietly, carefully, like I was building a case for a crime I never wanted to believe happened. The living room camera caught them twice. Once when she came home for lunch, on a day she told me she couldn't, and the door opened and Dylan walked in behind her like he belonged there, and she laughed and said, "Hurry, we don't have long." Another time she sat on the couch talking into that second phone and said, "He's so trusting, it's almost sad." And Dylan's voice came through tinny but clear. "Trusting people are the easiest to live around." I sat in my car at work on my break and watched that clip until my hands went numb on the steering wheel. But the worst part was yet to come, because the more I watched, the more I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a routine, and routines have consequences. I chose the confrontation carefully, because I didn't want a screaming match that ended with her rewriting history, and I didn't want her to have time to delete things or spin stories. I waited until I had copies of the clips, screenshots of the messages she left open, and notes of dates, And then I scheduled another quick call with my lawyer to make sure I understood my options. When Melissa came home on Friday, smiling too brightly, I said, "We need to talk." And she tried the casual dodge. "Can it wait? I'm exhausted." And I replied, "No, it can't," in a tone that finally made her stop moving. We sat at the kitchen table, the place we'd planned vacations, and argued over paint colors and shared good news, and I put my laptop down between us like a judge's bench. She looked at it and said, "Why are you being weird?" And I said, "You tell me." And she blinked hard and whispered, "I don't know what you mean." I clicked play. The video showed her saying, "I'm home," in that soft voice, and her face drained of color like someone pulled the plug. "That's nothing," she said too fast. "I was talking to my sister." I clicked the next clip, Dylan walking in behind her, her laughter, her words. "Hurry, we don't have long." She stood up so abruptly her chair scraped, and she said, "You're spying on me?" And I said, "It's a security camera in our living room, and you knew it was there." She swallowed and tried, "It's not what it looks like." And I leaned forward and answered, "Then explain what it is, and don't insult me with something lazy." She started crying, the kind of crying that felt practiced, and she said, "I was lonely." And I said, "You were not lonely, you were unfaithful." And hearing the word out loud made her flinch. She reached for my hand and I pulled back, and she said, "Please, we can fix this." And I asked, "When were you planning to stop?" She wiped her cheeks and whispered, "It just happened." And I opened the second phone I'd taken from her purse while she was in the shower that morning, placed it on the table, and said, "It didn't just happen. You carried a whole second life." Her eyes locked on it, and she said, "Give that back." And I replied, "After you tell me who else knows." She shook her head and said, "Nobody." And I scrolled to a message where Dylan wrote, "My wife thinks I'm traveling next week." And I read it out loud. Melissa covered her mouth and said, "You don't understand. He said he was separated." And I said, "He said whatever kept you cooperating." Then she tried anger, because that's what people do when excuses collapse, and she snapped, "You're not perfect either." And I said, "I never betrayed you." And my voice stayed calm, which seemed to scare her more than yelling would have. What I discovered next made my blood run cold, because she finally admitted, "We met here, in this house," like it was a detail, not a knife. The karma didn't come from me throwing plates or posting online or trying to humiliate her publicly, because I didn't want chaos. I wanted justice that held up in daylight. I filed for divorce with the evidence my lawyer said was relevant, and I followed every instruction like it was a lifeline. Melissa tried to switch strategies again, telling me, "If you do this, you'll ruin us." And I answered, "You already did. I'm just acknowledging it." She begged, "Let's do counseling." And I said, "Counseling is for problems, not for double lives." She promised, "I'll quit my job." And I replied, "You can quit whoever you want. It doesn't change what you chose." In mediation, she tried to paint me as controlling, and my lawyer calmly presented the timeline and the clips and the phone messages, and you could almost hear the mediator's patience evaporate. Melissa's face kept folding in on itself as her version of events shrank under real proof, and when the settlement came down, I kept the house and the majority of our shared assets, because infidelity mattered where we live and the documentation was undeniable. But there was another layer, and I didn't even have to push it, because Dylan's wife, Claire, found out through her own thread of clues right around the same time. I reached out once, carefully, through a neutral message and said, "I think our spouses have been lying to both of us, and I have evidence if you want it." And she replied, "I already suspected. Send what you can." When Claire confronted Dylan, she recorded his excuses, and she told Melissa's workplace HR after Dylan tried to use company time and resources for his affair, and suddenly, his funny new system helper reputation turned into a liability. But the worst part was yet to come for them, because they thought they were just stealing time, not triggering consequences that ripple through families like storms. When it finally collapsed, it collapsed fast. Melissa moved out within a week, and the silence in the house felt loud at first, like I could hear every corner where we used to be a couple. Dylan was put on administrative leave while his company reviewed policy violations, and Claire filed immediately, and the man who liked to call trusting people easy discovered that courts and contracts are not easy, not at all. Melissa called me one night, voice shaky, and said, "He's not answering me. He promised he wouldn't abandon me." And I said, "He promised you what you wanted to hear, and you accepted it because it made betraying me convenient." She cried, "I didn't think it would end like this." And I answered, "I did, because lies always end. They just don't end on the liar's schedule." She tried one last time, soft and nostalgic. "Do you ever miss us?" And I said, "I miss who I thought you were." And that was the truest thing I'd said in months. After the divorce, I changed the locks, repainted the bedroom, and took down the photos that felt like props from a play I didn't audition for. Claire and I never became friends exactly, but we checked in a few times like survivors comparing notes, and she told me, "I used to think karma was a cute idea people say to feel better." And I replied, "I used to think it was slow, but it's not. It just waits until it has enough to work with." And when my life started to feel mine again, when mornings stopped hurting and nights stopped looping in my head, I realized the evidence didn't just end my marriage, it ended the illusion that I had to accept betrayal quietly. If this story gave you chills, that subscribe button is right there.